The Duke of Blackthorn bought himself a wife and then refused to speak to her. He took Eleanor Ashcombe's hand at the altar, placed his ring upon her finger, and looked at her as though she were another debt settled by his solicitor. Before the wedding breakfast was cold, every person in the house understood one thing clearly. The new Duchess had been paid for, not chosen. This is a story of broken vows, quiet rebellion, and a woman who entered a silent house only to make its dead heart speak again. The church smelled of wet wool, old stone, and beeswax burned down too far. Rain pressed against the stained glass in thin grey lines, and Eleanor Ashcombe felt the damp creep through the soles of her slippers as she stood beside the most powerful man she had ever met. His black glove enclosed her hand without warmth. His signet ring, heavy with the Blackthorn crest, flashed each time the candlelight trembled. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" The Duke did not look at her. "I will," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and entirely without tenderness. Eleanor repeated her own vow with her chin steady, though the lace at her throat scratched like nettles and her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves. Behind her, the few Ashcombe relations who had troubled themselves to attend sat in stiff poverty, smelling faintly of lavender water used too generously to hide worn fabric and anxiety. Her father, Sir Edmund Ashcombe, kept his gaze lowered. Debt had bent him these past 2 years, first at the shoulders, then at the soul. Across the aisle sat the Blackthorn household in darker grandeur. They had come wrapped in silk, jet, and judgment. At their centre, the Dowager Duchess watched Eleanor as one might watch a servant, carrying crystal too fine for her hands. When the clergyman pronounced them, man and wife, no cheer rose. The sound that followed was the rain, the shifting of silk skirts, and somewhere near the back, the dry cough of the Duke's solicitor. Eleanor turned slightly toward her husband. "Your Grace," she said softly. He did not answer, not a nod, not a whisper, not even the courtesy of a glance. She did not flinch, not yet. The Duke offered his arm because the ritual demanded it. Eleanor placed her hand upon his sleeve and felt nothing living beneath the black superfine, but muscle held rigid as iron. Together they walked down the aisle beneath a roof that seemed to have swallowed every prayer ever spoken inside it. At the church door, the wind struck her veil back from her face. Rain dotted her cheeks. The Duke's carriage waited, lacquered black, its lamps glowing yellow in the morning gloom. His crest shone upon the door, a thorned branch wrapped around a crown. Sir Edmund caught her wrist before she stepped outside. "Nell," he murmured, using the childhood name he had not earned the right to use that day. "You understand why this was necessary." Eleanor looked at his fingers around her glove. His nails were clean, but his cuffs were frayed. Behind him, his second wife stared at the carriage as if she could already smell the Blackthorn money crossing into Ashcombe hands. "The mortgages will be paid?" Eleanor asked. Sir Edmund's face twitched. "Yes, the Duke's settlement is generous. And Thomas's commission? Secured. And Mary's schooling? Yes, child. All arranged. Child, the word might have hurt more had she not buried that part of herself before dawn. Then you have sold me efficiently," Eleanor said. Her father's mouth opened. No defense came. The Dowager Duchess, who had approached silently enough to hear, smiled without pleasure. "My dear," she said, "let us avoid vulgar language on so solemn a morning. A marriage settlement is not a sale, it is civilization." Eleanor curtsied because poverty had taught her the difference between pride and stupidity. "Of course, Your Grace." The Dowager's black eyes moved over Eleanor's plain ivory gown, altered from her mother's wedding dress, its sleeves let down with lace that did not quite match. "Wives," the older woman said, "learn quickly, those who do not tend to suffer." The Duke, standing only a few paces away, heard every word. Still, he said nothing. That silence told Eleanor more than anger could have done. At Blackthorn House, the first thing Eleanor noticed was not its size, though it rose from the moor like a fortress carved out of rain. It was the smell. Stone chilled by centuries, smoke trapped in old tapestries, beeswax, damp rush matting, and the faint medicinal bitterness of laudanum somewhere. The polish, a line of servants waited in the entrance hall, their faces arranged into obedience. Above them hung portraits of dead Blackthorn men with hard mouths and women pale as pressed flowers. The late Duchess occupied the place of honor above the staircase. She had been painted in blue satin, one hand resting upon a cradle, her fair hair dressed with pearls. Her painted eyes seemed to follow Eleanor as she crossed the threshold. No one introduced the portrait, no one needed to. The Duke removed his gloves. "Mrs. Vale," he said to the housekeeper, "Her Grace will be shown to the East Rooms." Those were the first words he spoke after the wedding vows. They were not spoken to Eleanor. The housekeeper dipped a curtsy. "Yes, Your Grace." Eleanor waited, expecting some private instruction, some cold explanation, some sentence that would define what sort of prison she had entered. The Duke turned away. "Blackthorn," the Dowager said sharply. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. "She is your wife," the Dowager continued. "You might at least tell her where she is permitted to dine." A muscle moved in his jaw. "She may dine where she pleases," he said. Then he walked up the staircase alone, past the portrait of his dead wife, and disappeared into the west wing. The servants kept their eyes lowered. Eleanor heard the rain ticking against the high windows. Somewhere deep in the house, a door closed with the finality of a coffin lid. But the inevitable morning never came. There should have been a breakfast where strangers measured her worth over tea. There should have been a bridal chamber, whispered about by maids and mocked by footmen. There should have been some cruel, ordinary shape to her humiliation. Instead, Blackthorn House gave her silence. Mrs. Vale led Eleanor through corridors where the air grew colder with each turn. The East Rooms were handsome, unused, and impersonal. Fires had been lit, but too recently. The marble mantel still breathed winter into the room. Her trunk stood beside the bed, already delivered, already absorbed. On the dressing table lay a pearl comb she had never owned. "A gift from His Grace?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Vale's mouth tightened. "It belonged to the late Duchess." Eleanor looked at the comb and did not touch it. "Take it away, please." The housekeeper's eyes flickered with something almost like approval. "Very good, Your Grace." Before Eleanor could remove her veil, a small sound came from the corridor, not a knock, a breath. She turned. A child stood in the open doorway. He was small for 5, with dark hair too neatly brushed and grey eyes far older than his face. His black velvet coat made him look less like a boy than a mourning miniature. One hand clutched the carved wooden horse at his side. The other hung curled against his chest, as if he had forgotten what hands were for. Mrs. Vale stiffened. "Lord Henry," she said gently, with a warning folded inside the tenderness. "You must not wander." The child did not look at her. He looked only at Eleanor. Every whisper Eleanor had heard in the church returned at once. The Duke's son, the motherless heir, the boy who had not spoken since the night the first Duchess died. Eleanor lowered herself slowly until her skirts brushed the carpet. The wool was rough beneath her knees. "Good morning, my lord," she said. The child stared. Behind him, at the far end of the corridor, the Duke appeared. For the first time that day, his composure broke. "Henry," he said. The boy moved before his father could take another step. He crossed the threshold, walked straight to Eleanor, and lifted one small hand toward her face. His fingers touched the edge of her damp veil. They trembled once, then steadied. Eleanor did not breathe. The child's lips parted. A sound came out, cracked from disuse and small enough to be mistaken for the house settling in the rain. "Mama." The room went still. Mrs. Vale covered her mouth. The Duke stopped as though shot, and Eleanor Ashcombe, purchased bride of Blackthorn, knelt in her borrowed rooms with a dead woman's son touching her veil, while every secret in that house seemed to wake at once. The word did not leave the room when the child was carried away. It clung to the damp veil in Eleanor's hands, to the ash settling in the grate, to the Duke's white knuckles upon the doorframe. Lord Henry had spoken only once, yet Blackthorn House answered him with the silence so complete that even the rain against the glass seemed to soften itself. "Take him to nurse," the Duke said. His voice held command, but not steadiness. Mrs. Vale bent toward them. "Come, my lord." Henry's fingers closed around Eleanor's veil before the housekeeper could draw him back. The silk pulled at her hairpins. Eleanor lowered her head and untangled it herself, slowly, so he would not feel robbed. "I shall see you again," she whispered. The boy looked at her mouth, then at her eyes, as if words were birds he had once known how to catch. The Duke crossed the room. Henry. At that name, the child's hand fell. He retreated without crying, without protest, with the wooden horse pressed hard against his chest. Eleanor saw the small red crescent marks his fingernails left in his palm. When he was gone, the Dowager Duchess entered as if summoned by the disgrace. "Well," she said, drawing her black shawl tighter. "That was unfortunate." Eleanor rose from the carpet. Her knees bore the imprint of the weave. "A child speaking after long silence seems more blessing than misfortune, Your Grace." The Dowager's gaze sharpened. "You have been Duchess for less than an hour. Do not mistake accident for affection." The Duke stood between them, but his attention remained fixed upon the empty doorway. "Why did he call me that?" Eleanor asked. No one answered. Dead women did not stay buried at Blackthorn. That night, Eleanor dined alone. A silver tray arrived in the east sitting room. Clear soup gone lukewarm, boiled fowl, apple tart, and a glass of wine pale as rainwater. The footman who delivered it did not meet her gaze. His sleeve had been mended at the cuff with thread too dark for the livery. "What is your name?" Eleanor asked. He froze with the tray still in his hands. "Peter, Your Grace." "Thank you, Peter. The fire is smoking. Would you ask for the flue to be checked when it is convenient?" He looked startled by the word "thank you." "Yes, Your Grace." The next morning, she found a scullery maid in the passage near the still room, biting her lip over a burn where hot sugar had spat across her wrist. Eleanor took the girl's hand before she could hide it. "Cold water first," Eleanor said. "Not butter. Butter traps the heat." The girl blinked. "Cook says butter seals it, ma'am." "Cook is excellent with pastry, I am sure, less so with burns." Mrs. Vale appeared at the end of the passage in time to hear it. For one narrow moment, Eleanor expected correction. Instead, the housekeeper fetched clean linen and said nothing while Eleanor wrapped the wrist. By luncheon, the servants no longer scattered quite so quickly when Eleanor entered a room. By tea, someone had replaced the smoking logs in her grate with dry beechwood. By evening, she had learned that the West Wing had been locked for 11 months. "No one uses those rooms?" Eleanor asked Mrs. Vale as they stood before the staircase landing, where a velvet rope hung across a corridor. "No, Your Grace." "By whose order?" Mrs. Vale's fingers tightened around her key ring. "His Grace's." Eleanor looked past the rope. The air beyond it held a different smell: dust, closed fabric, and the sour trace of old medicine. "The late Duchess's rooms." Mrs. Vale's throat moved. "Among others." Before Eleanor could press further, a sound came from behind the closed double doors, one soft thud, then another. Mrs. Vale's face lost colour. "Old houses settle, Your Grace." That did not sound like stone. "No, Your Grace." Yet the housekeeper did not move to unlock the doors. At the breakfast table the following day, the Dowager Duchess placed an unopened letter beside Eleanor's cup. The seal was black, impressed with the Ashcombe crest. "It arrived this morning," she said. "Your father writes promptly when money is concerned." Eleanor touched the seal, but did not break it. The Dowager poured tea with a hand that did not tremble. "You will find, my dear, that a wife's usefulness lies in obedience. Under the law, your person is now sheltered by your husband's name. Your property, unless carefully settled otherwise, is absorbed into his. A beautiful arrangement when everyone remembers their place." Eleanor lifted her cup. "Then I am fortunate I brought so little." The china clicked against the saucer, the only sign that the Dowager had heard the insult. Later, searching for paper in the nursery schoolroom, Eleanor found the first thing no one had meant her to see. It lay behind a row of broken primers, wrapped in faded blue ribbon. A small journal, its pages filled in a woman's careful hand. Not a diary, exactly, a nursery record. Henry's meals, his fevers, his first steps, the words he had learned, the days his mother had sat with him after supper. The last written page ended 11 months before. Eleanor read the final line twice. Henry cried at the west door again. Says he heard Mama arguing with Mr. Vale over the accounts. Eleanor's breath caught Mr. Vale, the late steward, Mrs. Vale's husband. A man everyone had told her died of apoplexy within a month of the Duchess. The ribbon slipped from Eleanor's fingers. On the desk beneath the journal sat 3 estate ledgers, their leather spines newly polished, their dates old. She opened the first. Several lines had been scraped thin with a penknife and written over in darker ink, a payment to a physician, a locked wing, a child who had spoken 1 word, and beneath the altered sum, faint but still visible, was a name Eleanor had already heard whispered in the servants' hall. The name beneath the scraped ink was almost gone, but not gone enough. Eleanor bent closer until the candle warmed her cheek, and the smell of old leather, dust, and iron gall ink filled her throat. The darker hand above had tried to bury the original entry beneath a payment for roof repairs, but the blade had cut the page too thin. Under the lie, the first letters still breathed, Mr. Julian Thorn, the dowager's nephew. Eleanor had heard his name at luncheon the previous day, spoken with the fond indulgence reserved for men who spent other people's money beautifully. Mr. Thorn had managed certain estate matters during the Duke's mourning. Mr. Thorn had advised the tenants. Mr. Thorn had been most useful when His Grace would not leave the West Library for weeks at a time. Eleanor closed the ledger before her hand could leave a mark upon the page. From the corridor came the soft scrape of a shoe. She turned. No one stood there. Only the schoolroom door, slightly open, and the long passage beyond it, where the lamps burned low enough to make every portrait seem alive. By morning, Eleanor had asked Mrs. Vale for the account-room key. The housekeeper's lips pressed thin. His Grace does not permit ladies in the estate office. His Grace permits his steward to misplace 3 years of rents, Eleanor said, laying the altered ledger upon the table between them. I am merely admiring the disorder. Mrs. Vale looked down at the page. For a moment, the woman's hand moved toward the name, then stopped short. My husband kept those books once, so I was told. He was a careful man. Eleanor waited. Mrs. Vale drew the key from her ring, then placed it on the table without meeting Eleanor's eyes. Careful men still die. The estate office smelled of cold ashes, sealing wax, damp paper, and mice. Ledgers crowded the shelves, some upright, others shoved in crookedly, as if someone had searched in haste. Eleanor removed her gloves and began sorting by year, tenant, tithe, timber sale, and household expenditure. By noon, black dust had settled into the creases of her fingers. By dusk, she had found 6 rents entered twice, 3 repairs paid to tradesmen who had never signed a receipt, and a suspiciously regular allowance sent in banknotes to London. The smallest clue was the most damning. One charge listed 12 shillings for black pins during the late Duchess's mourning. No respectable house purchased mourning pins by the dozen after the burial. They were bought before the body was laid out. Eleanor copied the entry onto a separate sheet. At supper, the Duke came to the east sitting room without being announced. Eleanor rose. Ink stained the side of her wrist. His gaze went first to the papers, then to her hand. You have been in the estate office? Yes, Your Grace. I did not give you leave. No. The short answer struck harder than defense would have done. The Duke's face closed. My mother says you have questioned the servants. She says you have opened household books that do not concern you. Your tenants' rents concern the duchy, my duchy. Eleanor folded the copied sheet once and slid it beneath the blotter. Then you may wish to learn who has been bleeding it. His eyes hardened. Take care, madam. The fire cracked between them. I am taking care, she said. That appears to be the offence. His hand tightened around the back of a chair, but he did not answer. In the silence, a small sound came from the next room, a tap, then another. Eleanor turned her head. The Duke heard it too. His face changed before he mastered it. Henry? Eleanor called softly. No reply came. The Duke stepped past her and opened the adjoining door. The room was empty, but upon the carpet lay the wooden horse Lord Henry carried everywhere. Its painted flank had been split, and inside the hollow body, a twist of paper had been hidden. The Duke picked it up before Eleanor could reach it. What is that? she asked. He opened it, read, and his expression sharpened. Then he folded it closed. Nothing. Eleanor held out her hand. Your Grace. No. His refusal left the room colder than before. At that moment, the unopened letter from her father slipped from the mantle and landed face upward near her shoe. She had not broken the seal since the dowager placed it beside her cup. Now the black wax had cracked, and inside, one line showed where the paper gaped. The creditor calls at Michaelmas. If the Duke delays, we are ruined. Eleanor looked from the letter to her husband. The Duke had paid for her, but someone else had already spent the price. After midnight, she returned to the estate office with a candle cupped in her palm. The house had settled into its long, watchful quiet. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stopped. The shelf was bare. The 3 altered ledgers were gone. On the desk, where she had left her notes, lay a strip of white linen cut from a mourning shroud. Across it, in a thick, uneven hand, someone had written 7 words in brown ink. Stop digging, or another Duchess will be buried. Eleanor's candle guttered. And behind the locked west door, a child began to cry. The cry behind the west door was not loud enough to summon the house, but it was shaped to find Eleanor. It came through the keyhole, thin and broken, soaked in the smell of dust, old lavender, and medicine left too long in closed rooms. Eleanor stood in the dark estate office with the shroud linen in one hand and her candle in the other, hearing Lord Henry weep where no child ought to have been. The warning upon the desk seemed to darken as the flame bent toward the door. Mrs. Vale reached the corridor. First, shawl thrown over her nightdress, keys clutched against her breast. Open it, Eleanor said. The housekeeper stared at the locked west wing. His Grace forbade. Open it. That tone did what pleading could not. Mrs. Vale's hand shook once before the key entered the lock. The door groaned inward. Cold rolled out. Eleanor stepped into a corridor long shut from ordinary breath. Holland covers draped the furniture like sleeping bodies. A dead fire stood in the grate of the nearest sitting room. The air carried violet powder, stale wax, and the bitter almond scent of old laudanum. At the end of the passage, Lord Henry crouched beside a painted screen, both hands pressed over his mouth, as if someone had taught him that even crying was dangerous. Eleanor lowered the candle and went to her knees. Henry, his face lifted. Tears had cut clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. Door, he whispered. Mrs. Vale made a sound behind her. Eleanor held out her hand. Who brought you here? Henry looked past her, toward the dark rooms beyond. No, the word was small, but it had teeth. Eleanor did not reach for him until he reached first. His fingers locked around hers with such force that her wedding ring bit into her skin. She gathered him against her, feeling the hard tremor under his ribs. A footstep sounded in the passage behind them. The Duke stood there in shirt sleeves and a dark dressing gown, his face stripped of all courtly coldness. What happened? He demanded. Henry flinched so sharply that Eleanor wrapped both arms around him. The Duke saw it, his mouth closed. He was locked in, Eleanor said. His eyes moved from Henry to the open west door, then to Mrs. Vale. By whom? No one answered. Dead silence was an answer. Blackthorn House knew too well. The next day, Henry was kept in the nursery, but he would take broth only from Eleanor's hand. The nurse hovered by the hearth, muttering that children who had been frightened ought to be given a cordial to settle the nerves. What cordial? Eleanor asked. Godfrey's, Your Grace. Only a spoonful. Eleanor turned. No opiate draught will pass his lips without his Grace's order and mine. The nurse's chin tucked down at once. Godfrey's cordial was sold in towns as commonly as peppermint lozenges, given to infants to quiet them, to servants to keep babies still, to tired mothers who had no rest. Eleanor had seen one child sleep too long after it. Henry watched the nurse leave. Then he tugged Eleanor's sleeve. Bitter, he said. Eleanor stilled. What was bitter, darling? His eyes shifted to the nursery door. Mamma's cup. The spoon in Eleanor's hand touched the saucer with a bright click. A coal settled in the grate. Henry pressed closer. Blue room. Rain, Mamma angry. Eleanor reached for the nursery journal hidden beneath her shawl. With whom? The boy's breathing quickened. He took the carved horse from his lap and rubbed his thumb over the split flank. Duel. Julian? His lips folded inward, then, barely, Grandmama. Eleanor felt the room alter around her, not visibly, not loudly, but the walls seemed to lean. What did Grandmama say? Henry shut his eyes. The effort made his small face tighten. No magistrate. The phrase struck Eleanor with such force that she forgot the breath in her lungs. A child of 5 could seldom be relied upon in court unless a justice believed he understood the nature of an oath. Every adult in the house would know how easily his words could be dismissed as fancy, fear, or coaching. But he had not invented those words. Before Eleanor could ask more, a sealed note slid beneath the nursery door. No footstep followed. She crossed the room and picked it up. The paper was plain, folded once, without direction. Inside, in a hand finer than the threat upon the shroud, was written, "If you value the boy, burn the journal." Henry stared at the note. Then he whispered one more word. "Cellar." Eleanor turned toward the corridor, where the house had begun its usual morning stir. Somewhere below, a bell rang for breakfast. The Duke would be in his study at that hour. If she could place the journal, the note, and Henry's words before him together, even his pride would have to bend. She left Henry with Mrs. Vale for the time it took to cross the house. It was less than 10 minutes. When Eleanor returned, the nursery door stood open. The broth bowl had overturned upon the rug. Mrs. Vale lay slumped in the chair, breathing, but senseless, the faint, sweet smell of drugged cordial at her lips. Lord Henry was gone. The nursery smelled of spilled broth, crushed herbs, and betrayal. Eleanor crossed the rug in 3 strides and caught Mrs. Vale before the woman slipped farther down the chair. The housekeeper's pulse fluttered beneath Eleanor's fingers, weak but present. Beside the overturned bowl, one small button lay in the wet wool, black horn torn from a child's coat. "Henry," Eleanor called. No answer came. She ran to the corridor. A maid at the far end dropped a stack of linen at the sight of her. "Which way?" Eleanor demanded. The girl's lips parted, but fear clamped them shut. "Speak, the back stairs, Your Grace." I heard shoes, a man's shoes. Eleanor gathered her skirts and flew down the servant's stair, one hand scraping the wall where the plaster sweated damp. At the bottom, the kitchen passage split toward the still room, the boot hall, and the cellar steps. The air below carried coal smoke, onions, wet leather, and something sharper beneath it, cordial. She seized the lantern from a peg and descended toward the cellars. Halfway down, a voice rang from above. "Eleanor." The Duke stood at the head of the stairs with Julian Thorne beside him. Julian was handsome in the polished, useless way of silver, laid for a table no one meant to eat from. His pale gloves were spotless. His expression was not. "There she is," Julian said. "Your Grace, I told you she would go below. She has had an unnatural hold over the boy since the wedding day." Eleanor gripped the rail. "Henry has been taken." "So you say," Julian replied. "Yet Mrs. Vale was drugged after being left in your care, and the boy vanished from the very room you commanded." The Duke's gaze struck Eleanor like winter rain. "Is this true? I left him for less than 10 minutes to fetch you, with a journal you refused to show me," he said. "I was coming to you with it." Julian sighed softly. "How convenient." The Duke descended 2 steps. "Give me the journal." Eleanor looked at his open hand and saw not a husband, not even a judge, but a man trained by grief to distrust the living. "No," she said. The word cracked through the stairwell. Julian's eyes brightened, the Duke's face hardened. "You forget yourself. I remember the child." For one moment, there was no sound but water dripping somewhere beneath the stone. Then the Duke turned to the footman behind him. "Escort her Grace to the East rooms. Lock the door. No one enters without my order." Eleanor stared at him. "You would confine me while your son is missing." "My son," he said, each word cut clean, "will be found by men who have not spent 3 days tearing open my house." Julian lowered his eyes to hide his pleasure. Eleanor placed the nursery journal inside her bodice against her stays, where no gentleman's hand could search without scandal. Under English law, a wife's person might be governed by her husband, but even a duke would hesitate to have her stripped before servants. Shame, at least, could still be turned into armor. The footman approached. Eleanor let him take her arm. She did not fight him. At the landing, Peter appeared with a coal bucket in both hands. His gaze flicked to Eleanor's face, then to the cellar door behind the Duke. A faint sound rose from below. 3 taps. A pause, 3 taps again. Henry's wooden horse had made that sound against the nursery floor when he wanted Eleanor to look at him. Peter dropped the coal bucket. Black lumps spilled across the tiles. The footman holding Eleanor cursed and bent to avoid them. In that single broken instant, Peter shoved the pantry door open with his shoulder. "This way, Your Grace," he breathed. Eleanor slipped from the footman's grasp and plunged through the pantry, past hanging hams and jars of preserved cherries sealed under pig's bladder. Peter pulled aside a flour bin, revealing a narrow service hatch behind it. "Old passage to the ice house," he said. Mr. Vale used it when the Duke's father kept brandy from the excisemen. Eleanor did not waste breath thanking him. She crawled through the hatch, dust filling her mouth, stones scraping her sleeves. Behind her, the Duke shouted her name. Ahead, the passage sloped down into cold. At the far end, light trembled beneath a warped door. Eleanor pressed her ear to the wood. Julian's voice came muffled through the boards. "The brat remembers too much." Another voice answered, older and colder, the dowager. "Then make certain he remembers nothing by morning." Eleanor's hand closed around the latch. Inside the ice house, Lord Henry sat bound beside an old travelling chest, his cheeks wet, his mouth gagged with linen. Beside him lay 3 missing ledgers, the late Duchess's blue nursery journal, and a cracked china cup stained dark at the rim. On the underside of the cup, written in the dead Duchess's own hand, were 4 words Eleanor could scarcely breathe through: "If I die, search here." And beneath the chest lid waited the truth of her final hours. The chest did not open like furniture. It opened like a grave. Eleanor tore the gag from Henry's mouth first. The child dragged in air with a raw little sound and fell against her so hard that his bound wrists struck her bodice. "Mama," he choked. Her hands shook only after she had freed him. Behind her, the ice-house door struck the wall. The Duke filled the doorway, breath ragged from the passage, his hair disordered, one sleeve streaked with flour dust from the pantry hatch. He saw Henry in Eleanor's arms. Then he saw the ledgers, the stained cup, and the writing beneath it. "If I die, search here." The colour left his face. Julian Thorne stepped from behind the old ice racks with a pistol in his hand. "Touch that chest," he said, "and the boy loses another mother." No one moved. That was the truth of Blackthorn House. It had not been haunted. It had been governed by cowards with keys. The dowager stood behind Julian, her black silk hem brushing the frozen straw on the floor. "Put the child down, Eleanor. You have made enough spectacle." Eleanor shifted Henry behind her skirts. "No." The pistol tilted. The Duke took one step forward. "Julian, stay where you are, Blackthorn." Julian's polished voice had cracked open to something meaner. "You were useful grieving. Do not become troublesome awake." From the passage above came running feet, then Peter's shout, then Mrs. Vale's voice, hoarse but alive. "Down here! They are down here!" Julian turned his head. That single breath saved them. The Duke struck him with the force of years unslept. The pistol fired into the ice-house wall, splintering brick. Henry screamed into Eleanor's gown. Julian fell, and the Duke drove his knee into the man's wrist until the pistol clattered across the stones. The dowager moved toward the door. Mrs. Vale appeared there, holding a heavy brass warming pan in both hands. "Take one more step, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, "and I'll forget I was bred to service." By noon, the great hall of Blackthorn was no longer silent. Servants lined the walls. Tenants stood near the doors, caps in their hands. The local magistrate, Sir Aldous Fenwick, had arrived with 2 parish constables and a clerk whose ink froze in small clots whenever the hall door opened. In that age, before any proper police force reached such country corners, justice often came on horseback, in a mud-splashed coat, carrying a warrant folded beside a dinner invitation. Eleanor stood at the long table, with Henry's hand inside hers. The Duke stood opposite, not beside her. Sir Aldous broke the seal on the packet found beneath the chest lid. A letter addressed to His Grace, never delivered. The Duke's fingers flexed once. "Read it," Eleanor said. The magistrate looked to the Duke. Blackthorn nodded. The letter was from the first Duchess, written in a hand weaker than the nursery journal, but unmistakably the same. She named Julian Thorne. She named the Dowager. She wrote of missing rents, forged timber sales, and an apothecary's bill for laudanum and bitter almond water charged under false repairs. She wrote that she had confronted them in the Blue Room. She wrote that if she were found dead, it would not be by fever, nor by grief, nor by God. The Duke gripped the table edge. The clerk read the final line. They have made my own cup unsafe. A murmur moved through the hall. The Dowager's mouth thinned. A hysterical woman's fancies. Mrs. Vale stepped forward, pale beneath her cap. My husband found the altered books. He meant to tell his grace. And died of apoplexy? Eleanor asked. Mrs. Vale lifted her chin. He was given a cordial after supper by Mr. Thorne's man. He never woke. Julian laughed once from between the constables. Servants' tales. Henry tugged Eleanor's hand. Every face turned toward him. The Duke's eyes lowered to his son. Henry, the boy swallowed. His free hand crushed the carved horse to his chest. Grandmama said. His voice trembled, but Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. No magistrate. The Dowager's nostrils flared. Henry looked at Julian. Jewel put bitter in Mamma's cup. The hall went dead still. Sir Aldous removed his spectacles. That is enough for an examination. The apothecary will be summoned. The physician too. Eleanor drew the 3 altered ledgers forward, and these accounts will explain why they needed her silenced. The Duke looked at the scraped pages, then at the woman he had locked away while she saved his heir. His face seemed to age in the span of a breath. He came around the table. Eleanor stiffened, expecting command, defense, some final remnant of pride. Instead, the Duke of Blackthorn went down on one knee before her, in front of servants, tenants, magistrate, mother, and son. His head bowed until his dark hair nearly touched her ink-stained hand. Your Grace, he said, the title breaking in his mouth. I have wronged you beyond pardon. Eleanor did not pull away. She looked past him as the constables took Julian Thorne by the arms, as the Dowager's black shawl slipped from one shoulder. As Blackthorn House watched the bride it had pitied become the one person no one could dismiss. Justice had entered the hall at last, but love remained outside the door, waiting to see whether silence would open it. By evening, Blackthorn House smelled less of secrets than of opened rooms. Dust rose from the west wing in pale clouds as maids pulled down Holland covers, and footmen carried out trunks that had sat untouched since the first Duchess's death. Windows long sealed were thrown open, and the cold moor air moved through the passage like a blade drawn through old cloth. In the Blue Room, where a woman had once lifted a poisoned cup to her lips, Mrs. Vale stood with both hands clasped around her key ring and watched the curtains come down. Burn them, the Duke said. No one questioned him. Eleanor stood near the threshold. Henry pressed close to her side. The boy had not let go of her gown since the magistrate departed with Julian Thorne and the Dowager's written order of confinement. The Dowager herself had been taken to her dower house under watch, stripped not of title but of power. For a woman of rank, public disgrace travelled faster than any constable. Peter carried the last covered chair into the corridor. When he passed Eleanor, he bowed, not the small, uncertain bow of a servant humouring a new mistress, a true bow. Your Grace, he said. The words moved through the hall like a match set to dry tinder. One maid curtsied, then another. The cook appeared from the lower stair, flower on her forearms, and bent her head with fierce awkwardness. Even the old butler, who had treated Eleanor as temporary furniture, lowered his eyes. Your Grace, he said. Eleanor's fingers tightened once around Henry's shoulder. She had been called Duchess since the wedding. That evening, for the first time, the house meant it. At luncheon the next day, the Duke ordered every servant in Blackthorn to assemble in the great hall. Eleanor entered last, expecting ledgers, instructions, perhaps some new arrangement of household authority. Instead, she found the Duke standing before the gathered staff, with his bare head bowed. Mrs. Vale had returned to her place, pale but upright. Henry sat beside Eleanor, turning his wooden horse in his hands. The Duke looked at the servants first. Many of you were dismissed, frightened. or silence during my withdrawal from this house, he said. Some were threatened, some were bribed. Some tried to speak and were not heard. His gaze found Mrs. Vale. Her mouth trembled, then steadied. That failure was mine. No one breathed loudly enough to be heard. Then he turned to Eleanor. I wronged my wife before you all, he said. I refused her speech, trust, protection, and honor. She gave all four to my son when I did not know how to give them to anyone. Eleanor's hands folded in her lap. The Duke came to stand before her chair. He did not kneel this time. The hall had already seen him humbled. This was something harder. A man choosing truth without spectacle. Eleanor, he said, using her name for the first time before them all, I ask your forgiveness. Not as Duke to Duchess, as the man who locked the door while you ran toward the danger. A sound came from Henry, then small as a spoon, striking porcelain. Papa. The Duke's face changed. He reached for the back of the chair but did not touch the boy, as if afraid sudden hope might frighten him away. Henry looked down at his horse. Don't lock, Mama. The blunt little sentence opened the hall more cruelly than any accusation could have done. The Duke bowed his head. Never again. Midway through the afternoon, an unopened letter arrived from London, sealed with the magistrate's mark. Eleanor broke it in the library with the Duke standing across the desk. The apothecary had been found. His book recorded purchases under Julian Thorne's name, laudanum, bitter almond water, and a draught sold as a sleeping mixture the week the first Duchess died. Sir Aldous would send for the coroner to reopen the matter, though exhumation required authority and would scandalize half the county. Eleanor laid the letter down carefully. So it will not be buried again, she said. No, the Duke answered. Not while I live. The old estate books were restored to the office that same evening. The false payments were marked, the tenant's arrears corrected, and the steward's chair, once Julian's preferred throne, was left empty until an honest man could fill it. Blackthorn was not healed, no house was healed in a day. But its doors no longer seemed to listen with malice. After supper, Eleanor found the pearl comb from the late Duchess's dressing table, placed outside her chamber door. Beside it lay a folded note in the Duke's hand. Meet me in the West Garden if you can bear to hear me speak. Eleanor stood very still, the comb gleaming at her feet like a relic returned from the dead. Duty had brought her to Blackthorn. What waited in the garden would decide whether anything more could remain. The icehouse door opened as if the grave itself had drawn breath. Eleanor stood before the old travelling chest with Henry behind her skirts, his small fingers locked in the torn fabric of her gown. The cold had reddened his cheeks and numbed her hands, but the words beneath the stained cup burned hotter than any fire in Blackthorn House. If I die, search here. The Duke stared at the cup as though his dead wife had spoken across the years. The writing was faded but unmistakable. He had known her hand once. He had received notes from it. Invitations, household orders, small messages left beside his breakfast plate. Now that same hand accused his own blood. Julian Thorne stepped from the shadows with a pistol raised. Close the chest, he said. The dowager stood behind him, still dressed in black silk, her face pale and composed beneath the icehouse gloom. Do not be theatrical, Eleanor. Give me the boy, and this may still be handled privately. Privately? Eleanor's voice did not rise. As your daughter-in-law's death was handled, as Mr. Vale's death was handled, as Henry's silence was handled. Julian's finger tightened on the pistol. The Duke moved 1 inch toward his son. Do not, Julian warned. You were better when you were grieving, Blackthorn. Grief made you blind, and blindness made you useful. The Duke stopped. For the first time since Eleanor had met him, she saw not coldness in his face, but ruin. The man who had bought himself a wife and refused to speak to her now stood before the truth he had avoided, and every silence in his house had turned against him. Henry pressed his face into Eleanor's gown. Mama, he whispered. That single word crossed the icehouse like a bell. Julian glanced at the child. The Duke struck. He moved with the force of a man attacking not another man, but the years he had wasted believing lies. The pistol fired wild into the brick wall, shattering a spray of frozen mortar. Eleanor dropped over Henry, covering him with her body as the sound crashed through the stone chamber. Julian hit the floor hard. The Duke drove his knee into Julian's wrist until the pistol fell from his hand. Julian cursed, twisted, and reached for the weapon with his free hand, but Peter appeared in the doorway and kicked it beneath the ice rack. "Enough," Peter said. Breathless, Mrs. Vale followed with a brass warming pan lifted in both hands, her face grey from the drug still lingering in her blood. The Dowager stepped toward the side passage. Mrs. Vale barred her path. "Move aside," the Dowager ordered. The housekeeper's grip tightened. "No, Your Grace." The title no longer sounded like respect. It sounded like a sentence. Within the hour, the great hall of Blackthorn filled with witnesses. Sir Aldous Fenwick, the local magistrate, arrived with 2 parish constables, his boots streaked with mud and his clerk struggling to keep ink from thickening in the cold draughts. In that age, before proper police reached every country place, justice often arrived in a gentleman's coat, carrying authority folded in his pocket and suspicion written across his face. The chest was brought in and opened upon the long table. Inside lay the missing ledgers, the late Duchess's nursery journal, a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon, and an apothecary's account book. Eleanor stood beside them with Henry's hand in hers. Across from her stood the Duke, bareheaded, silent now for a reason very different from cruelty. Sir Aldous broke the ribbon. The first letter was read aloud. The late Duchess had written of altered rents, forged timber sales, and money diverted through Julian Thorne into private accounts in London. She had written of confronting him in the Blue Room. She had written of the Dowager telling her that a duchy must be protected from soft women with inconvenient morals. She had written of a cup that tasted bitter. The Duke gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. The magistrate read the final line. "If I am found dead, it was not fever, not grief, and not God." A murmur moved through the hall. Julian laughed from between the constables. A dead woman's nerves, nothing more. Mrs. Vale stepped forward. "My husband found the altered books. He meant to show his grace." "And then?" Sir Aldous asked. "He took a cordial after supper," she said. "Mr. Thorne's man brought it. My husband never woke." The Dowager lifted her chin. "Servant's grief makes poor evidence." Eleanor placed the cracked cup before the magistrate. "Then use their own accounts. The apothecary sold laudanum and bitter almond water under Mr. Thorne's name. The charges were hidden as repairs to the east roof." Sir Aldous turned pages in the account book. His expression hardened. Then Henry tugged Eleanor's hand. Every person in the hall looked down at him. The child swallowed. His wooden horse trembled against his chest. "Grandmamma said no magistrate," he whispered. The Dowager's face changed. Henry looked at Julian. "Jewel put bitter in Mamma's cup." No one spoke. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Sir Aldous closed the book. "Mr. Thorne will be taken for examination. The Dowager Duchess will remain under watch until the coroner and county authorities are satisfied." Julian lunged once, but the constables seized him before he crossed a step. "You owe me," he spat at the Duke. "You left everything to us. You left the house, the books, the boy." The Duke crossed the hall and struck him open-handed across the face, not like a gentleman in a duel. Like a father, Julian fell silent. The Dowager looked at her son with cold contempt. "You would disgrace your own mother for that woman?" The Duke turned toward Eleanor. The hall seemed to widen around them. On their wedding morning, he had taken her hand at the altar, placed his ring upon her finger, and looked at her as though she were another debt settled by his solicitor. Before the wedding breakfast was cold, everyone in the house had understood that the new Duchess had been paid for, not chosen. Now, before servants, tenants, magistrate, mother, and son, the Duke of Blackthorn walked to the wife he had humiliated and lowered himself to one knee. His head bowed over her ink-stained hand. "I bought your name with money," he said, voice rough enough to wound him on the way out. "You answered with courage. I gave you silence. You gave my son his voice. I locked you away, and you still ran toward the danger I refused to see." Eleanor looked down at him, her face pale, her gown torn. Henry pressed against her side. "Rise, Your Grace," she said quietly. He did not move. "Not until you know this before all." them. You are not a bargain. You are not an ornament. You are the Duchess of Blackthorn. And I am the man who must spend whatever remains of his life proving worthy of the wife he never deserved. Henry reached out and touched his father's bowed head. "Papa," he said. The Duke's breath broke. Eleanor did not forgive him there, not before the hall, not as spectacle. But she placed her hand over Henry's, and in that small mercy, Blackthorn House learned where its true power had settled. Julian Thorne was taken from the hall before dusk, his fine gloves muddied and his coat torn at the shoulder. The dowager was removed to the dower house under guard, her authority cut away from Blackthorn like rot from timber. The apothecary was summoned. The coroner reopened what grief and rank had once buried. Servants who had been dismissed returned with folded caps and cautious eyes, and Mrs. Vale stood again at the head of the household keys. The west wing was opened room by room. Curtains came down, fires were laid. The blue room was scrubbed until lavender, poison, and old fear no longer clung to the walls. No one spoke loudly there at first, but the silence had changed. It no longer commanded. It listened. That night, Eleanor found the Duke waiting in the west garden, where the rain had left the gravel dark and shining. He held the pearl comb that had belonged to the first Duchess. "I should have asked before it was ever placed in your room," he said. "Yes," Eleanor answered. He accepted the blow with a lowered gaze. "I do not ask you to love me," he said. "I have no right to ask even your peace. But I ask leave to speak now, after all the harm my silence has done." Eleanor looked toward the house. A fire had been lit in Henry's nursery, and its glow trembled gold against the glass. "Then speak honestly," she said. So he did, not beautifully, not easily. He told her of grief, of shame, of the cowardice that had disguised itself as dignity. He told her he had feared loving his son because the boy's face reminded him of the woman he had failed. Eleanor listened until the cold reached through her slippers and into her bones. At last she said, "I will remain for Henry. I will remain for the estate. What I become to you must be earned." The Duke bowed his head. "Then I shall earn in silence no longer." Months passed, and Blackthorn did not become gentle all at once. Old houses remembered, but spring reached even the locked places. The tenants saw rents corrected and repairs honestly paid. The account room became Eleanor's domain, its ledgers no longer weapons but witnesses. Henry grew steadier with each week, first with single words, then broken sentences, then questions that filled the nursery from morning until dusk. The Duke learned to knock before entering Eleanor's rooms. He learned to wait for answers. He learned that forgiveness was not a door thrown open, but a threshold of approach with clean hands. On a mild afternoon, when the hawthorn bloomed white along the garden wall, Eleanor walked with Henry between herself and the Duke. The child carried his wooden horse, repaired with a strip of silver at its split flank. Near the gate, he stopped and looked up at her. "Mamma," he said clearly. "May we go again tomorrow?" Eleanor's fingers closed around his. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow." The Duke looked at her then, not as a debt settled, not as a woman purchased into his house, but as the heart that had kept it from dying. They walked on together beneath the pale flowers, and behind them the great gates of Blackthorn closed with a soft iron sound, while a child's laughter crossed the garden where silence had once ruled. Thank you for watching this complete story. Eleanor's journey was about quiet courage. A woman dismissed as a bargain, who became the one person brave enough to face the truth. If this story moved you, please like the video, because it helps the algorithm bring more emotional historical romance dramas to viewers who love them. Share it with a fellow historical romance lover who enjoys dukes, duchesses, secrets, betrayal, and hard-won redemption. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next full story. And now tell me in the comments, did the Duke deserve Eleanor's forgiveness, or should she have remained only the Duchess in name?